Welcome to Save the Frogs office hours. I am Save the Frogs founder, Dr. Kerry Kriger, March 22nd, 2021, here with Save the Frogs board member Mike Horton. And we are excited to answer your questions and provide advice on amphibian conservation, environmental careers, and getting good things done for nature and wildlife. So we're going to start this out. We got a question that came in the chat from Molly, and I'm just going to read it out as written. Here it is. I was wondering if you have advice on best practices for tissue sampling for DNA extraction, especially for threatened species. So I understand toe clipping is pretty common, but have also heard that survival rates after clipping are difficult to measure, making its welfare and survival implications difficult to measure, and so not necessarily an appropriate technique, especially for tree frogs. Buccal swabs, that's in the mouth, are low impact but also harder to extract DNA from and have a higher tendency towards contamination. My supervisor recommended tadpole sampling where possible, since juveniles have such a low survival rate anyway, that it's likely to have the lowest impact on the species as a whole. But then what would be best for species with direct development? I'm going to start right there and say, get a permit and get expert advice. The second you say, definitely the second you say extraction from threatened species, I'm thinking legal issues. So make sure that if you're handling a threatened species, if we're talking about legally protected threatened species, you definitely want to have permits or ensure you don't need them, which you probably do, and get expert advice. If you have to ask me, then you should be asking an expert on this, of which I don't consider myself an expert, but I have done it, and I know enough about it to continue reading this question, and let's keep going. I understand toe clipping is pretty common, but have also heard that survival rates after clipping are difficult to measure. You could consult my paper that's free to download. Go to Save the Frogs Academy, find the course that's called Dr. Kerry Kriger's Publications, and I do have a paper called Survivorship in Wild Frogs Infected with Chytridiomycosis. Should have been called Infected with Chytrid Fungus. Anyway, that's a good place to start. Threatened species, get a permit. Tissue sampling, it sounds like you need to do significant research, as in when I was doing my PhD research, that was 14, 15 years ago. I'm sure that a lot has changed. I'm sure there's more modern techniques than existed then. I'm sure there's also far more papers that have been written comparing different techniques. So you need to do a literature review on what are your options overall, and of those options, which could be applied to fulfill your goal, which I'm still not sure what your goal is. So the first step is, do you truly need these samples? If you do, then you need to know what are the options for your study and what are the implications of each. All of them are going to have potential issues, but some are going to be better than the others. So my question for the scientists in the world who do like DNA, and for those whose whole job it may be to develop protocols and ways of getting the DNA and using the DNA, is why can't you use it from the mouth? Do you need mitochondrial DNA? Do you need a liver? Do you need a toe? I don't think so. But as I said, I'm not up to date on this stuff, so I don't think you need a toe. Usually toe clipping is not necessarily for the DNA. It's for marking an individual so that you can pick up a frog in the future and say, oh, the left toe is missing, and therefore it's because of me or someone in my lab, which is definitely not ideal for obvious purposes. There are other ways to mark a frog which is to say to recognize it in the future. That may be from being a good photographer. That'll come down to the species and their coloration and such. So it would be good to know what your true goal is to determine the best way forward. But I would definitely start with a literature review of, if you really need DNA, then I'd go for a literature review. And if you're associated with a university, which it sounds like you are, you should have access to lots of scientific journals. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so about 25 years ago, I ran the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery permit program for threatened and endangered species in Northern California. And so I'm sure a lot has changed since then. Um, but I've been involved in the process up until about 5 or 6 years ago. I can tell you, with a threatened or endangered species, the service is going to be really hesitant to provide a permit that involves some sort of sacrifice, that involves toe clipping. Um, the things you would have to show are just like Kerry said, one, that you have to do it this way, that there is not another way to get um, decent results. Two, you have to be able to show that your research will contribute to the actual conservation and recovery of the species, not just gathering information, not just gathering information that you can make the argument that, well, if we know more about the species, we're more likely to be able to conserve it. No, you're going to have to show that you have a direct tie to conservation if you're going to do something like that. Interestingly enough, about, I don't know, 40 years ago, 35 years ago, um, I was a graduate student or an undergrad student and doing a squirrel study, and we had toe clipping. And I'll tell you, that experience is what led me to actually moving into endangered species conservation. As an undergrad, my first thought was, I bet you can't clip toes off of listed species. And primarily that is true. It is very hard to get approval to do stuff like that. One thing to consider is, what do you need the data from, in terms of, are you just looking for a sampling of individuals to gather information from, or are you looking for information, genetic information from certain specific populations, certain individuals? If what you need is just genetic data, then you can work with the service to coordinate with their consultation program where they permit the destruction of habitat. And one of the things that they will typically do is require that the developer actually trap and remove individuals that are likely to be directly killed. And if so, then you can work with the service to collect those individuals. And usually at that point, you can have the authority to euthanize them if you need it, because essentially they've permitted the destruction of their habitat. Um, the other thing is, if you don't actually, if they aren't actually going to trap and remove them, you can still coordinate with the consultation or the permitting division of the service to simply coordinate with developers that are going to be destroying areas where part of the requirement of their approval from the service would be to allow you to get on the site and do whatever trapping and catching ahead of them, and then do your sampling. So I would try and take that approach.
All right, thanks, Mike. Molly is going to speak and let us know what's going on.
Right, so what it is that I'm wanting to do is an island phylogeography study, like looking at frog species between different islands. Um, and I'm sort of, I well, I might need to write to you about a grant application that's in for the project that I'm adapting this from, where like the permits were already sort of like not all in, but more or less in the pipeline, and it's all being sort of rapidly shuffled to a different island and a different system entirely due to COVID travel restrictions. But that's one where the island is one of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is like a lot of the land is under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Park Service, and to do the genetic comparisons, we would need to get we'd need to get DNA, but we'd probably specifically need to get mitochondrial DNA. I'm still sort of like everything is changing at once, so I haven't done the literature review yet because of changing things over. But yeah, it would likely need to have some mitochondrial DNA. My thought was that so the supervisor that I'm working with who does the genetic testing said that usually buccal samples are harder but not impossible to extract DNA from, and they just they require usually much more expensive reagents, and then if you can get just actual tissue samples, it's much easier. So what the frog species are that are present there's one threatened coqui and then 4 just very common unthreatened coquis, and then a Cuban tree frog and the cane toad, and 1 leptodactylus. So,
and are there other ways to get data on the biogeography aside from DNA? Or I'm sure there are, but is that like a critical component of it? Because you could first do the other methods of comparing the populations.
so it's a study of the genetic, the phylogeography, sorry, is what I'm
okay.
So it's specifically comparing the St. John populations of these frogs to the Puerto Rico and St. Croix populations, which are the ones that are currently present in GenBank.
Okay. From a genetic perspective, you're not interested in morphology or vocal calls or anything else.
Well, I could take the general natural history data of them, but I'm not necessarily expecting to be able to find visible macro level differences between the populations of these frogs. I think probably people would have noticed by now if those existed, but particularly because there could be cryptic island speciation, I feel like it's worth looking at.
All right. So assuming you need the DNA and there's a certain type of DNA that you need, or you've spoken of 2 choices. Okay, you can take the mitochondrial, which I'm assuming means you have to do, we'll call it invasive sampling. Okay, versus, which could even include death. I'm not sure what the options are. Toe at the best, liver at the worst.
Yeah.
Is that true to get the mitochondrial? Are those your only options, or how else does one get mitochondrial DNA?
So basically, I think that it's possible, as far as I understand, it is possible to extract some mitochondrial DNA from a buccal sample. It's just much more difficult.
Yeah.
So what I was thinking I would try and do is do of the threatened species, do only buccal sampling, especially because this is a undergraduate summer research project. I'm not doing a major thing. I certainly don't expect to be able to get permits for destructive sampling of an invasive of a threatened species. But for the non-threatened species, I think it would be useful to be able to get more robust samples, but just from an animal welfare perspective, I would like to do that in a non-destructive way if I can. So I was wondering, can you take blood samples, for example, or does that have a negative
Yeah,
survival.
I'm not an expert at all on that. So, but what I think when I hear it is, here's what happened during with I sampled 3,000 frogs during my PhD research, and there's different methods. There's the published methods from the experts who are indeed experts, but they said you've got to run all these samples in triplicate, meaning you've got to analyze every single sample 3 times. And so I did my own research, and I said, what happens if I only run the sample once, but I take 3 times as many samples, or I, use that money for something else? How much is that truly going to affect it? And I looked at the actual data, and then I ended up writing a research publication that said you don't need to run it 3 times, only run it once, take more samples. It doesn't have to be 3 times as much. So when I'm hearing you talk about these choices, okay, so the swab from the mouth, it's it maybe doesn't give you as much information, but you can sure sample frogs a lot faster going like that in their mouth than doing the destructive sampling. And you're going to be able to sample a lot more frogs with a lot less problems from the government, a lot less ethical problems, and a lot less problems just in general. So it seems like there's another the fact that we need to talk about this is that I've been thinking about this for 15 years is saying there's a massive gap in the scientific knowledge of how do we properly get DNA from a frog without having to hurt the frog. Of which, to me, DNA it's all over the organism, and we've got tons of abilities on how to deal with and study DNA. So either it does exist and you need to keep looking for the answer, or you're not going to get it taken care of in an undergraduate summer. But if you want to help out a lot of frogs far into the future and prevent a lot of students and researchers from having to deal with the same issue, a good PhD project would be how do we improve our methods of non-invasively capturing the DNA that we need from amphibians. So I think I don't know what else I can say on the topic. So let's start out. Let's kind of do a quick recap. One, do you truly need to do you need the DNA? That's the question. So that's a whole before anything else. So your professor may say we need the DNA. You still need to say, do I truly need the DNA? Is there something else that I can do if I'm not comfortable with what the professor says? Which most students at some point are going to have to come to terms with this. Their professor wants them to do something. The professor doesn't want to do it themselves. That's why they get a student to do it. Or that maybe they don't have time. Maybe they would like to do it, but they're like, hey, can you go do this? And sometimes they're going to say things that you don't want to do. So that's the first step. If you do want to do it, literature review, contact some experts. By experts, I mean people who they know all about DNA and PCR and quantitative PCR and different extraction techniques, and you'll just get them from literature review, who's got recent papers within the last 5 years, who's quoted a lot. Try to contact them and take it from there. And then also, I would explore what can you get from swabbing their mouth? Is it enough? Can you take more samples? Even if I don't know how it works, but say maybe only 20% of those samples are usable. Okay, catch 5 times as many frogs, swab their mouth, and let them go. Okay, so I hope that helps. Mike,
I
do you
would
have
I would
anything
also, yeah,
further
I
on
would
this?
add if you're in the Virgin Islands, I don't believe there's any US federally listed amphibians there. So my guess is if something is classified as threatened, it's the World Organization that's listed it. And if that's the case, then the federal government in the US won't require permits. Park Service will have their own requirements because they have requirements to maintain viable populations of certain species on their lands. But those requirements are usually a lot less stringent.
All right, thank you, Mike. All right, thanks, Molly, for sharing, and good luck with your project. All right, I can, if you do have something, let's see, I just saw this. Okay, yeah, it's IUCN listed. Usually that transfers over, but not necessarily.
No,
All
it
right.
doesn't. It's much more
Okay.
extensive.
Okay. All right. So let's see.
It does
We've
transfer
got
the other
people
direction
out.
generally. If it's federally listed, it's usually listed under that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And everyone out there, this is Save the Frogs office hours. The goal is to advise you and answer your questions, of which I'm guessing if you're here, you do have a question about amphibians. So please send it in. All right, Sierra just moved to a new city and asked, what would you suggest we do to promote frog conservation on Save the Frogs Day in April? So I don't know if this has anything to do with moving to a new city other than would be good to know where are frog populations there, what amphibian species live there, and who in your city, if anybody, cares about frogs or does something for amphibians. So those would be good things to know. But as far as promoting frog conservation on Save the Frogs Day, we're still in a kind of COVID affected era. So it depends on if are you talking about online, in person? You don't have to be in person to, if you want to physically print things out and deliver them like posters or flyers to somewhere that people do physically hang out. But it would be good if you chatted in. Are you referring to doing an in-person event, or are you talking about online, and that will affect things? But whatever it is, go to savethefrogs.com/day. That's a good place to start, and make sure you read through all of our materials. I am shortly going to update that page, which I haven't looked at in a year. And I know that in the past we have created thorough suggestions on ways people can take part in Save the Frogs Day events and organize an event and be a successful organizer. So I'm going to go and make sure that that info is still on the page, easily found. I'll probably even create a course in Save the Frogs Academy called Save the Frogs Day. That will have all of our suggestions for how to hold a successful Save the Frogs Day event. So, Save the Frogs Academy, some of you may not be familiar with. And if you're not familiar with it, go to savethefrogs.com/academy. If you are able to log in, good. If you're not able to log in, that's fine. Go click the 28 days free access button and start out there. Educate yourself for the next 28 days about amphibians. What would you do to gain access to Save the Frogs Academy at the end of your 28 days? You could become a Save the member in one of two ways. You can go to savethefrogs.com/membership, set up a recurring donation to Save the Frogs for $10 a month or $100 a year, or go to savethefrogs.com/scholarships and apply for a Save the Frogs scholarship, which would cover your Save the Frogs membership so that you wouldn't have to donate. But of course, Save the Frogs scholarship recipients are still allowed to and encouraged to donate at whatever level is possible and meaningful to them. All right, so Sierra, if you want more detailed information on that, let me know if you're talking online or in person. Everyone else out there, if you have a question about amphibian conservation, amphibians, there was a question here. I totally skipped that. Sarah asks, are there conservation jobs that don't require a college degree? My job didn't require a college degree because I created my job. But in general, people like to ask for your CV before they hire you, your resume, but you definitely don't need a college degree. And as every year goes by, we move more into a society where the only thing employer truly cares about is what can you do, which is going to be based on what have you done. So I'd say, no, you don't need a college degree. I'm not sure what stage you're at right now. If you're like in college and maybe the question suggests that you don't want to finish your degree, or perhaps you're in high school and you're just considering whether or not to even go to college. So a little more info would be good, but I'll say, no, you don't need a degree. If I were to hire someone, yeah, I have hired people. Let's get to some real experience. The longest Save the Frogs employee that I ever had, he didn't have a college degree, and he did an excellent job. And it didn't matter to me that he didn't have a degree. And we certainly had this kind of conversation a lot. And he said, should I go get my degree? We'd have that kind of discussion. And I was like, I'd rather have you doing frog conservation than sitting in college fulfilling the required credit that they think you need that may have nothing at all to do with frog conservation. So I wanted him to have real world experience. He was going to learn a lot more about frog conservation doing Save the Frogs projects than going to college to get a degree. Now, you should go to college if you need the specialized knowledge that you can only or most likely get in college, such as access to a laboratory is good. If you want to be doing DNA extraction, a university has the resources to allow you, or a high likelihood that you'll be able to learn that and do that. So that's a good reason. There, of course, are other reasons, but that's my basic thoughts on it. Mike, you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, one of the ways, the farther you want to go in this field, the more either education or experience you're going to need. One of the best ways to get started is to go to a university that is doing some sort of a research project, and start by seeing if you can't pick up a paying job doing research field work. It'll be grunt work. It is quite honestly the most fun of the work in this field. As you go up the work, generally it's less and less fun. So it's that varies as to whether or not you'll be able to get one. It depends on how desperate a professor is who's doing a study, and particularly if they need some work done during the school year, that actually helps you a lot. However, if you can't get a paying job through that, then offer to volunteer, because one of the first things people will look for, if you don't have education, is experience. And if you volunteered for even a month on a project, a professor or a researcher is more likely to be looking for somebody who's working towards a degree. However, showing some experience with biological work, even if that experience is your own biological work, you did something on your own, you documented stuff and so on, that helps. But getting that experience is what you need. And then, education is next, even an undergrad as opposed to a graduate education. I have friends who never went on to get a master's, stuck it out, and have gone very far in the regulatory range of our area of conservation. So those are the things I would look at: experience.
Yeah, I'll also add, it definitely never hurts to have a degree. And sometimes, depending on the organization, it could be required, especially if it's kind of an old school or potentially bureaucratic organization. That may just be a requirement. But this just came to mind because I see this announcement pretty much every year. I receive this announcement from the federal government every year in spring, and here it is. Came out the other day. The National Park Service is seeking one G7-7 permanent career seasonal $20.93 per hour biological science technician fisheries for the Division of Resource Management and Science in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, California. I won't go on. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll skip right to the end. To be competitive for this position, applicants must have experience implementing projects involving aquatic fauna and high elevation ecosystems, experience leading field crews and managing large data sets, considerable backpacking experience in high elevation mountains, the desire to work in remote wilderness for weeks at a time, and a strong commitment to conducting ecological restoration. So that says nothing about your traditional educational background. So I think
But I
that's a
will
good
say,
example.
but I will say,
yeah.
But Kerry, from that example, you will need a degree to get that position. However, because of what they're looking for, it's pretty obvious that they're looking for somebody to run a crew. Probably the people on that crew will not need a degree. And if you can get on that crew and you can do that for a summer, at that point, your experience can substitute for a degree. So that's where you try and get on some sort of a project that will get you that experience, because what you read at the beginning indicates that you need either a degree or a certain level of experience. So in the federal government, you can substitute experience for a degree.
Yeah, and as Mike said, this position was not the starting position. This is assuming you've probably done something like that before, and you're going to be leading people. So at your level, getting on the crew. So you could, in this, where did I read this from? The Save the Frogs Discord server. What is the Save the Frogs Discord server? It's a chat room forum for Save the Frogs members, including scholarship recipients. savethefrogs.com/scholarship. So, I mean, I can give you this info. They want me to share it right now. I'll just pop in the URL. The URL does not give a full explanation, but I'll type in the guy's name, who always is the one announcing it. You can look him up and say, how do I get on the crew? If if that sounds good. This is going out backpacking into the wilderness for probably weeks at a time. You're going to learn a lot about field efforts for amphibians. So it is a good starting point. If that,
it's actually, I actually think it's exactly the starting point you're looking for, because one, things like this where you go out into the backcountry and stuff like that, often they have a hard time finding people willing to make that commitment. And so the more you're willing to commit and the less you're willing to work for, the more experience you're going to be able to get, is what it amounts to.
All right, so next question from Sarah's. So how would you suggest contacting conservation groups in order to do internships? I'd suggest contacting them after having researched who they are and ensuring that is the type of group. Don't just send out blindly like, I'm looking to intern, you have anything happening? You will get no response or a no as a response, probably. But if you're familiar with the group, you know that they do the kinds of things that are of interest to you. They may have a place on their website, such as savethefrogs.com/volunteers, where they actually list out what's going on. There are certainly some websites too. If you go online and search environmental jobs, environmental internships, I'm sure that there are sites that aggregate the some certain, they're like providing advertising to the organizations that seek these things. And there's also, Save the Frogs. I should have listed this thing on it. Recently, we created a page, and It is savethefrogs.com/jobs, I believe. Let's see what shows up there. Yeah, there it is. Savethefrogs.com/jobs, jobs in amphibian conservation. Now, I'm not actively listing jobs on there, but I've embedded a site that does. The site is based in the UK, conservationcareers.com, I think. They may have a dash in there. And it's got stuff, it's up to date because it's their listing embedded in our site that's kept up to date. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can hear a podcast interview of me on the Conservation Careers podcast. So go listen to that. I'd go check out their site, look through our listing, check out their site, because they probably also have some of these things, maybe paid internships. I would also go for a volunteer internship if you have the time and dedication to do that, especially in the environment. Most people probably have to start out volunteering to get some experience and connections. But in general, my first thought was you gotta know what organizations. This could be nonprofit groups. It could be government agencies. Uh, you could contact your local. That could be your city, your county, your state, your federal office of fisheries, fish and game, fish and wildlife, National Park Service, county board of fish and wildlife, who probably holds a local meeting every month, see who and board members and get to know people. But as far as an online search goes outside of government, there's nonprofit organizations and university research groups. Most professors have a website that says, this is our welcome to our lab. This is what we do. This is what we care about. These are the people in our lab. So you could contact them. You could also do the same basic thing for a nonprofit organization. They do stuff that you care about. You've taken some time, you got on their mailing list, attend their events like this, and make sure you understand a little bit about them. And then if they don't have a page with an application, then send an email. So note that you didn't just first send an email, you did a little bit of research, got to know them, so that you can compose a well-written, concise email. That means one paragraph, 2 paragraphs. I usually don't send a email longer than 2 paragraphs to anyone I don't know. I'm going to get straight down to the point as concisely as possible, 1 paragraph, and say, all in perfectly correct, grammatically correct English. No spelling mistakes. So if you're listening and English is not your first language and you're contacting someone whose first language is English, then have someone help you out. It doesn't have to be. Most people don't take my advice on this, but I know that when I receive an email and it's written in perfect English, I'm assuming the person is intelligent, because it's not easy to write in perfect English. So that's a good step, is having a well-written email. And then ideally you're saying, if you know what you want to do, that helps. Because if someone writes me and they say, I love frogs, how can I help? I'm going to have to interview you to figure out what your skills and interests are. Because I could say, can you fix our database? You're not interested in that, and you don't have the skills for that, but I don't know anything about you yet. So hopefully say what your skills are. How, if I said, help us save the frogs, what are you going to do? Maybe having one idea that you can just would help out. If you know what the organization does, you can say, what would you do? You can also say, I'm open to anything. Here's one thing I thought of. Mike, you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, so Sierra just put in here that she's got a biology undergrad degree, and so with that, you're perfectly set up. Definitely, with a biology undergrad, one of the first things to do is go to the wildlife or the biology department and start talking with professors, and just hustle to see if you can't get a research job. With that level of education, you have a reasonable chance of actually getting a paid job. Recognize that um, projects get implemented on the biological schedule, not necessarily the school or the academic schedule, which, if you already have a degree, can really work to your advantage, because a lot of these projects need to start before a lot of the people who are still in school become available. And so the sooner you get in there and talk to people, the more likely you are to nail something down. Once you get one job like that, then you're on your way, because now you have something to put on your resume. Um, if that doesn't work, a lot of towns and counties have environmental divisions. And if what you're looking for is simply experience, contacting them and offering to volunteer can be really good, because a lot of them, they just are so underfunded that they'll take people to do a lot of the field work. You could do sampling, just depending on what they're looking for and what they're trying to implement. So things like that. But I would start contacting universities and schools. If you're looking for a certain area, then in that area. But if you're looking beyond that, then all over the place, wherever you would like to go. Once you get into school and you start talking to professors, looking for projects, if they don't have anything, ask them for, if they know anybody anywhere else in another school or organization that might be looking for somebody. Just start beating the bushes like that. Once you sort of get on that trail, usually one thing leads to another, and you can usually find something out there. At first, it's not going to pay great, but often what it does is gives you experience, pays you a little something. Sometimes it'll give you room and board, depending on what the project is. Sometimes the room and board might be, beans and a tent, but you can survive on that.
Yeah, I'm going to add two things. And as far as what Mike said, I agree. The first thing I saw when you said you have the bio degree is start at your university.
Yeah.
Your university, like they actually have people paid to help their students get jobs when they get out. But aside from that, there's just the professors there. Some of them and I'm also assuming though that you have probably already started talking to them, but who knows? A couple more things. When conferences start up again, if there is a conference that you deem relevant, so I used to go to the World Congress of Herpetology, the joint meeting of ichthyologists and herpetologists. Now, I haven't gone in a long time. They're not as relevant to me anymore. But when I was doing my PhD research, those were the relevant conferences to go to. So if those are relevant to you, then if you can afford it, because they're not cheap, they do give out travel grants, probably only if you're a member, which may cost, I don't know. I don't know how much it costs, but they do give out some travel grants. They probably won't cover it all. You got to fly there, stay in a hotel in a big city. It's not necessarily cheap. And I never went there looking for a job. I went there to, aside from my first year, the rest of the time I was there to present. So if you have something to present, that'll definitely help. But regardless, you go there, be social, talk to people, attend the sessions, get to know what's going on, figure out whose research you like and who, you resonate with, talk to them, and that's a good start. The other thing is a CV or resume. You probably will send it to someone if you're applying for a job. So make sure it looks good. Have you put some time into it? Is it visually pleasing? Does it list the most important activities first? And every time you accomplish something in your career, add a bullet point to it. Okay? So this means you worked somewhere for 3 months. Put name of organization, title, 2 or 3 sentences about what you did there, dates, like August 2018 through December 2018 or whatever. Awards you receive, grants you receive, volunteer positions, conferences, presented at. I don't know if I would just put a conference. Now, there's definitely a reason to maybe just have a one-page CV, but my CV, I haven't added to it in years because I don't ever plan to work for anyone else again, and nobody asked me for my CV. It's on the website, so I don't think about it much to add stuff to it, but definitely for much of my career, I'd always be adding stuff to my CV. You know, if I accomplish something, it's going on there because otherwise you'll forget to put it there. And I always made sure it's formatted nicely because you're going to send it out and people are going to judge you based on it. So make sure it looks good. All right, any more questions? We've got about 12 minutes. If you have a question, if you seek advice, if you have a comment, has this been helpful? What do you want to see at future Save the Frogs office hours? What do you want to see from Save the Frogs in general? All right, so a question has come in from Michael in Tehama County, California. I'm not even sure where that is. Question is, I've been in the process of constructing a slow-moving creek with 2 ponds on each end to support the California red-legged frog in Tehama County, and I'm currently trying to determine which trees and plants are the most desirable for the riparian habitat in this climate. Can you recommend information sources where I might be able to find such info? I definitely don't know the specifics. You want to go native, so Native Plant Society. I can't remember what they're called. There's California. There's bound to be a Master Naturalists Society in your area, but there's also, I think it's called Native Plant Society.
Yeah, I think it
Maybe
is.
Mike, you know.
Yeah, I
So
think it is.
look up. I'd start with those and see what's in your local region. And then there's also like Master Gardeners. Do you know the name of that association? Like I think they're nationwide. Master Gardeners, or
And
look up the
Master
gardening.
Naturalist. There's also Master Naturalist.
Yeah,
as well.
so gardeners, naturalists, native plant people. The gardeners may not be native plant, but there may be some overlap, and I would just start trying to find out, their suggestions. And let's see, local biologists, contact the local university. There's probably a botanist there, and they can probably give you some information. I think that's all I have to say on it. All right, let's see if Anders read me. Krishna, who I believe is a Save the Frogs scholarship recipient. If you have any questions, now is the time. All right, here it comes. Dr. Phil Bishop, unfortunately no longer with us. Question is, I just heard Dr. Phil Bishop's recorded presentation on the Save the Frogs YouTube channel, and I think it's up. I think we have a New Zealand course in Save the Frogs Academy. He did give multiple presentations. One was probably 2017, and another was in 2010 or 2011. I just heard Dr. Phil Bishop's recorded presentation on the Save the Frogs YouTube channel, which hopefully everyone here is subscribed to. You can do me a favor. If you're not, go to savethefrogs.com/YouTube or youtube.com/savethefrogs. Click subscribe. All right, he talks about frogs found in New Zealand and explains several intricate details of their natural history, such as particular affiliation to specific microhabitats. I felt that knowing such details would certainly help, especially when the species are threatened. India's amphibian diversity, the place I come from, is comparatively higher than that of New Zealand. That's for certain, because New Zealand only has, I believe, 5 native amphibian species. My question is that in such regions where you have high diversity, with many of them being threatened, what would be the best method of collecting their natural history data? I could come up with one option, which is citizen science, but would be glad to hear your suggestions. Yeah, I would want you to be more specific, because natural history is basically at least from my viewpoint, is any info about the species is its natural history. So I would determine where do geographically, where do you want to focus? Is there a group of amphibians you want to focus on? Caecilians, salamanders, frogs, and keep narrowing it down, because you're not going to document the entire natural history of India's amphibians in this lifetime. There's a lot of amphibians there. There are a lot of scientists already working on amphibians in India, which is a good thing. So, literature review. What is your interest? Vocalization, morphology, ecology, breeding behavior. Figure out, you got to narrow it down to get your interest, because there's a million different things you could study. So figure out what you care about, and if you're going to need an advisor, then start getting to know potential advisors, and probably do something that fits in with their research. They're going to be able to give you the best advice if they have experience with it. As far as citizen science, if you know the kind of data you want and you think you have the knowledge to organize citizens, empower citizens, inspire citizens to go out there and collect that data. So that's social skills, technological skills in this day and age with a lot of citizen science, educational skills to get them up to speed. There's a lot involved with that. If that's your interest, then start learning about other citizens that have been successful with amphibians or wildlife in general. And I think that's, based on the info you've given, that's my suggestion. You have anything on that, Mike?
No, that covers it.
Okay. All right, so we got 5 minutes left, so now is the best time to send in your questions. Before I move on to another, Krishna also says, I wanted to specifically know about bush frogs and gather information on their reproductive biology in the Western Ghats. So there you go. You've narrowed it down. You've narrowed down the species or the genre. You've narrowed down the aspect of their natural history, reproductive biology, and you've narrowed down more or less the geography, Western Ghats. Okay, you can keep going further. So I'd encourage you, maybe that's fine, you want to do a comparative study of reproductive biology in the bush frogs, which I'm not familiar with what species those are or how many there are. But, from this information, there you go. I'm going to compare reproductive. Now, what aspect of reproductive biology? Not sure. But you could keep narrowing down. You may want to keep narrowing it. All frogs, one group of bush frogs, one species of bush frogs, reproductive biology, mating rituals, direct developers versus, stream dwellers versus. So keep on going down. And then Western Ghats, is that the entire Western Ghats or one particular mountain range? And then who else has done that? Who's the expert in India, ideally, on reproductive biology? Who's the expert on bush frogs? Who's the expert on the Western Ghats? You don't need any of them if you have the background right now to go out and get started. But probably a good idea to find those people, talk to them, and see what's been done, see what they think needs to get done, and see what the resources available to you are. All right, Sarah, on dissections. My daughter had a suggestion about preventing dissections in schools. We tried to promote your free dissection program to her middle and high school, but was unsuccessful. She wondered about local zoos breeding glass frogs and doing an outreach program so that students can get both hands-on learning but without frogs getting killed. Is this a workable idea? All right, so free dissection program. I can't even remember if our dissection info is still on the site, other than you can definitely, and you should go and Save the Frogs Academy. It's also on YouTube probably, so you don't even need to log into anything, and it's called, keyword dissections with Nicole Green of Animal Learn. So I'll type that in right here. So oftentimes I just send people straight to her because that is pretty much what she does, is work in the dissections field, we'll say, of preventing them and providing alternatives. So let's see. First off, 15 or so states, that's not a precise number, but a decent number of states allow you to opt out of dissections. But as far as changing your school, yeah, that comes down to, in part, dealing with people who may have their strong views on the subject. You may have dealt with a biology teacher who thinks that dissecting a frog or whatever else they're dissecting is a ritual that all students must go through because it's the way that it is. And so there's dealing with that, providing them ideas. But as far as like something else to do, yeah, it would be good. If you have a teacher who cares about this ethically, it resonates with them, then you'll have a higher chance of making something happen to say, hey, you want them to learn about frogs instead of killing them? Let's learn about conserving them. Here's an idea. We've got this local zoo. They've got glass frogs. They're breeding them, and hopefully that zoo has some conservation purpose or a strong environmental education program. They probably do, because in this day, with each passing year, zoos are moving more from an entertainment goal to. So yeah, I'm sure that zoo, they want people showing up at their zoo, and if they can get a school there, zoos love having schools come. And someone there is probably in charge of environmental education. So yeah, it seems like get to know the people at the zoo, find out who their person in charge of education is, talk to them, and then maybe the two of you send an invite to your school and try again. Even have to start out instead of dissection, let's go here. Maybe it starts out, let's go here. And then they're like, whoa, that was a lot cooler, more fun, more educational, more fulfilling than dissections. And maybe that will pave the way to just getting rid of the dissection program. And also, yeah, when I say get rid of the dissection, I'll say get rid of the dissecting of animals. Whereas there are other ways, you have, if you watch that video with Nicole Green, she goes through lots of different alternatives to a traditional dissection program.
I think the one thing I would add is when you approach the school about this, trying to add some information on the conservation environmental effects of collecting frogs and implementing dissection. One of the things you're going to be up against is a lot of teachers actually want kids to start getting hands-on experience with dissecting things. Just they think that's important.
I'd also suggest, if it's a public school versus a private school, things are going to be different. For a public school, I bet that you can ask them for information in the sense of a Freedom of Information Act, though it's, not necessarily federal. But I'd like to ask them, how much do you spend on your dissection program in real dollars every year? How much money goes into this program? That means you've got to buy the animals, you've got to buy the scalpels, you've got to buy the formaldehyde, etc. And I'd want to know who's your supplier, where do you get them from, what species are they? Are they wild caught? they're not even going to have these answers because they've never even thought about. They may have the money if they really start to look into it. They're not going to. They 98% probability they won't even know how to answer the other stuff, and that'll maybe set off a light bulb in their head saying, "We've never even thought about this stuff. What species are these? Oh, they came from Carolina Biological. That's a company." You go on a biological website, say Carolina Bio, send them a link to that, see how much info is. It's for me, it's easy to read it. They're hiding info on that webpage all about how good their dissection frogs are. They're not telling you species name. They're using fake names that don't exist. It's a I can't remember what name they use. They use some name of a frog that it doesn't even exist. It's not a scientific name. They're using a common name that's not even what's used for frogs. And they're saying these frogs, like, our northern leopard frogs come from Mexico. Huh? They're not. They don't live in Mexico. So once you start getting them to give you the info, it may help them realize they don't even know what's going on in their dissection program. Maybe that'll help. So, but yeah, it's a campaign you're engaged in when you go to change a organization's behavior, and it's not always easy, but it's probably fulfilling.
And if you're going to try and do that, in that situation, then it generally works better to get a collection of people as opposed to a single person. So trying to build support among other people.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, and if it's a public school, they probably have a PTA meeting. I'm not sure if these still exist, Parent Teachers Association, or just some kind of public forum, just like your, city council has a meeting every month. And, so I'm sure, or I'm not sure, but there's a high likelihood parents could show up. Be concise, just introduce people to the idea at first. And then maybe if you go again, update them on some things you found. Oh, I did some research and the school doesn't know what species these are. And that means it could be, so just kind of get the idea going and see who else, someone may come up to you and say, hey, I really like that. I'm surprised they're doing this. And then you've got twice as many people working on it. All right, so let's call that good. This has been Save the Frogs office hours, March 22nd, 2021. And we expect to be back here in a month. Maybe for the next one, we'll even have the May date set so that we can tell you all the precise day. Thanks for being here. If you have questions, and if you're in the Save the Frogs Discord server, post your questions there. Otherwise, you could always email them in, but I prefer you become a member of Save the Frogs if you're not, so that you do have access to the Save the Frogs Discord server, which is an ideal place to be posting questions and engaging in amphibious discussions. Otherwise, save it up for the next office hour. And if you know people who care about frogs, which you probably do, tell them to attend Save the Frogs office hour, savethefrogs.com/office. And if you're on social media, feel free to grab an image off the Save the Frogs website, ideally one that says Save the Frogs or savethefrogs.com. Post it up to your social media. Say, I just attended Save the Frogs office hours. It was awesome. Or whatever you want to say about it to hopefully encourage people to join. All right. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Mike, for your input. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you, Kerry. Talk to you tomorrow.